The sound of my hovercraft engines roaring to life shattered the afternoon silence of Ocean View Estates. Corinne Thompson stood frozen on her perfect patio, wine glass trembling in her manicured hand, as 30 of her closest HOA supporters watched in stunned disbelief. 2 minutes earlier, she had blocked my emergency vehicle with that smug smile of hers, certain that her locked gate would keep me trapped like every other resident in this pristine coastal prison. She thought she had won. She thought her iron grip on our community was unbreakable. But as my amphibious rescue craft lifted off the ground on its cushion of air, gliding effortlessly over her prize-winning roses and across her immaculate lawn, I saw something I had never seen before in Corinne Thompson's cold blue eyes. Pure, undiluted terror. That moment changed everything, because sometimes when the system fails you, you have to rise above it, literally. My name is Marcus Chen, and for 12 years I have been a certified marine rescue specialist. When I moved to Ocean View Estates 5 years ago, I thought I had found paradise. This exclusive beachfront community sits on 3 miles of pristine California coastline, where million-dollar homes perch on cliff tops overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Every morning, I would wake up to the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. The neighborhood looked like something from a luxury magazine. Perfectly manicured lawns stretched between Mediterranean-style mansions. Palm trees swayed in the ocean breeze. Tennis courts and swimming pools sparkled in the California sunshine. The emergency beach access road was one of the main reasons I chose this location. This narrow, paved road wound down from the main residential area to the beach, connecting directly to the coastal highway. For someone in my profession, having immediate access to the waterfront was not just convenient, it was essential. That road had served the community for over 20 years. Local emergency services used it regularly. Ambulances, fire trucks, and Coast Guard vehicles all relied on that direct route to reach beach emergencies quickly. The road was clearly marked and legally designated as emergency access. But then Corinne Thompson became HOA president. Corinne Thompson was the kind of woman who treated her position like a royal title. She stood about 5 feet 6 inches tall, with platinum blonde hair that never seemed to move in the wind. Her makeup was always perfect, even at 7 in the morning. She wore designer clothes to grocery store trips and drove a white BMW with vanity plates that read HOAQEN. From the moment she took office, Karen began implementing what she called community enhancement initiatives. These were really just excuses to control every aspect of our lives. She banned certain paint colors. She regulated mailbox designs. She even tried to dictate what types of flowers residents could plant in their own yards. Most of my neighbors were intimidated by Karen. She had a way of making people feel small with just a look. Her voice carried that special tone that wealthy suburban women perfect over years of practice. Sweet on the surface, but with an edge that could cut glass. I watched good people become afraid to express their opinions at community meetings. Families started second-guessing their landscaping choices. Children stopped playing in their front yards because Corinne complained about noise levels during her afternoon meditation sessions. The HOA board meetings became Corinne's personal theater. She would arrive with thick binders full of regulations and precedents. Her supporters would nod along to everything she said, while everyone else sat in uncomfortable silence. Anyone who dared to question her decisions would face weeks of harassment through official HOA channels. But I had bigger concerns than lawn ornament regulations. As a marine rescue specialist, I knew that emergency response times could mean the difference between life and death. Every second counted when someone was drowning or stranded in dangerous waters. I started noticing signs that Karen's obsession with community aesthetics was beginning to clash with practical safety needs. She complained about emergency vehicles disturbing the peace during responses. She questioned whether the beach access road was really necessary for modern emergency services. The warning signs were there. I just did not realize how far she would go to get her way. The call came in at 2:47 p.m. on a busy Saturday afternoon. A family of 4 had been caught by the rising tide while exploring the tide pools near Seal Point. The father had slipped on wet rocks trying to help his children to safety. Now all 4 were stranded on a small rocky outcrop, with waves getting bigger every minute. I grabbed my rescue gear and sprinted to my truck. This was exactly the type of emergency I had handled dozens of times before. The beach access road would get me to the scene in under 3 minutes. From there, I could deploy my rescue equipment and have the family safe within 10 minutes. But as I raced down Ocean View Drive toward the beach access road, my truck came to a screeching halt. A brand new steel gate blocked the entire roadway. Heavy chains and padlocks secured it to concrete posts that had been installed overnight. Bright yellow signs declared private property, no trespassing, HOA authorized personnel only. I could not believe what I was seeing. Karen had actually done it. She had blocked the emergency access road. I jumped out of my truck and ran to the gate, testing the locks. They were solid, professional grade. This was not some temporary barrier. This was a permanent installation designed to keep people out. That is when I heard Karen's voice behind me. Well, having some trouble, Marcus." I spun around to see Karen Thompson walking toward me with that infuriating smile of hers. She wore a flowing white sundress and carried a glass of iced tea like she was hosting a garden party instead of blocking emergency access during a life-threatening situation. "Karen, there is a family stranded on the rocks right now. I need to get through this gate immediately." She took a slow sip of her tea and shook her head. "I am afraid that is not possible. This road is now closed as part of our new beautification initiative. We simply cannot have emergency vehicles tearing up our pristine coastal environment every time someone gets themselves into trouble." My blood pressure spiked. People are going to die if I cannot reach them in time. "Oh, please, do not be so dramatic. I am sure there are other ways to reach the beach. Perhaps you should have thought about that before choosing to live in such an exclusive community." I could hear the radio chatter from my truck. The Coast Guard was being dispatched, but they were coming from 15 miles away. The local fire department would have to take the long route through the mountain roads. That would add at least 15 minutes to the response time. 15 minutes that this family might not have. "Karen, I am begging you, unlock this gate right now. Lives are at stake." She laughed, actually laughed. "Marcus, you really need to learn to respect authority. This gate stays locked. The HOA board voted on this decision, and it is final. Now please move your vehicle before I have it towed for blocking a private roadway." I had no choice. I could hear the urgency increasing in the radio transmissions. The waves were getting bigger. The family was running out of time. I jumped back into my truck and took off toward the mountain road that wound around the backside of the community. This route would take me through 15 miles of winding curves and steep grades before connecting back to the coastal highway south of our beach. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I pushed my truck as fast as I dared through those mountain curves. Every turn felt like an eternity. Every mile marker reminded me that precious minutes were ticking away while a family sat trapped on those rocks. The radio updates painted an increasingly desperate picture. The waves had reached the base of the rocks. The children were crying. The father had injured his leg in the fall and could not swim to safety even if he wanted to risk it. By the time I finally reached the beach access point 15 miles south and raced back north along the shoreline, Coast Guard helicopters were already hovering over the scene. Professional rescue swimmers were in the water. The family was being lifted to safety one by one. I arrived just as the last child was being hoisted into the helicopter. They were safe, traumatized but safe. But I was not safe. I was furious. Karen Thompson had nearly caused a tragedy with her petty power games. She had turned a routine 3-minute rescue into a 40-minute ordeal that could have ended in disaster. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening. I had requested it through official channels, citing safety concerns about the beach access closure. Karen tried to delay it, but enough residents had signed the petition to force her hand. The community center felt different that night. Usually, these meetings had maybe 15 people in attendance. Tonight, over 50 residents packed the room. Word had spread about the rescue incident and people wanted answers. Karen arrived fashionably late, wheeling in a professional presentation setup complete with charts, graphs, and legal documents. She had clearly spent days preparing for this confrontation. Her supporters filed in behind her like loyal soldiers, taking seats in the front rows. I sat in the back, watching as Karen transformed the room into her personal courtroom. She dimmed the lights and began her presentation with all the confidence of a seasoned politician. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we are here to discuss the future of our community. Some residents have expressed concerns about our recent beautification initiatives, particularly the closure of the old beach access road. Her first slide showed property value statistics for coastal communities. As you can see, communities with restricted beach access consistently maintain higher property values than those with unrestricted access. We are talking about protecting investments worth millions of dollars. Murmurs of approval rippled through her supporters. I watched my neighbors nodding along, their faces showing the same greedy satisfaction that Karen had perfected. Her second slide showed liability statistics. Furthermore, unrestricted emergency vehicle access creates significant legal exposure for our HOA. One accident, one lawsuit, and we could all face massive financial liability. This was classic Karen Thompson manipulation. Take a grain of truth and twist it into a weapon of fear. Make people choose between their wallets and their consciences. When my turn came to speak, I stood up slowly and walked to the front of the room. 5 days ago, a family nearly died because Karen Thompson decided that property values matter more than human lives. Karen interrupted immediately. That is completely false. Emergency services responded appropriately through established channels. Established channels that added 15 minutes to the response time. 15 minutes that could have been the difference between rescue and recovery. I presented my own evidence. Response time statistics, emergency service testimonials, documentation showing that the beach access road had been legally designated for emergency use since the community was built. But Karen was ready for this too. She stood up with her legal documents and began reading from municipal codes and HOA bylaws. Her voice took on that patronizing tone she used when she wanted to make someone feel stupid. Marcus, I understand that you fancy yourself some kind of hero, but the reality is that professional emergency services are far better equipped to handle these situations than amateur volunteers with delusions of grandeur. The room fell silent. She had just publicly questioned my professional credentials and competence in front of 50 neighbors. The insult hung in the air like poison. Your dramatic scare tactics might work in the movies, but this is real life. We have legal obligations to protect this community, not cater to your personal convenience. The vote was called. 7 board members would decide the fate of emergency beach access for our entire community. One by one, they cast their votes. Karen's supporters voted to maintain the closure. The few independent voices voted to reopen access. In the end, the result was 7-3 in favor of keeping the gate locked. I watched my neighbors file out of the room with their heads down. Some looked ashamed. Others seemed relieved that they would not have to make a difficult decision. A few shot me sympathetic glances, but none had the courage to speak up publicly. After the meeting, I overheard Karen talking to her closest supporters near the exit. That is when I learned the truly devastating news. The HOA vote was just the beginning, she said with obvious satisfaction. I have already been working with the city council to have the road closure made permanent and legally binding. By next month, even if the HOA wanted to reopen access, they would not be able to. Karen Thompson had not just blocked emergency access. She had engineered a complete legal takeover that would make her power permanent and unbreakable. Or so she thought. That night, I sat in my home office staring at maritime law books until 3 in the morning. There had to be a legal way around Karen's power grab. There had to be some loophole, some regulation, some precedent that could restore emergency access to our beach. That is when I found it: maritime emergency access rights. Federal law establishes that emergency vessels have the right to access any navigable waterway through the most direct route available, regardless of local zoning restrictions or private property rights. This law supersedes HOA regulations, city ordinances, and even state laws when it comes to water rescue operations. The key word was vessels. Emergency vehicles were restricted by Karen's gate, but emergency vessels could not be legally blocked from accessing navigable waters. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had not called in 3 years. Jake Morrison. Jake, it is Marcus Chen. I know it is late, but I need to ask you about that hovercraft you mentioned. Jake Morrison had been my supervisor when I worked with the Coast Guard 7 years ago. He was tough, experienced, and completely intolerant of bureaucratic nonsense. After retiring from active duty, he had started a private marine rescue equipment company. Marcus, good to hear from you, buddy. Yeah, I still have that SR-6 rescue hovercraft sitting in my warehouse. Been trying to sell it for months. Why do you ask? I explained the situation with Karen and the blocked beach access. Jake listened without interruption, and I could practically hear him grinning through the phone. So you want to buy a hovercraft to spite your HOA president? Brother, that might be the most beautiful thing I have heard all year. 2 days later, I drove to Jake's facility in San Diego to inspect the hovercraft. The SR-6 was a decommissioned Coast Guard rescue vehicle, built for amphibious operations in challenging conditions. It measured 18 feet long and 8 feet wide, with a flexible rubber skirt that trapped air underneath to create lift. The machine was powered by twin-turbine engines that could generate enough thrust to carry 12 people across water, sand, mud, snow, or any other relatively flat surface. Its maximum speed was 45 miles per hour, and it could operate in weather conditions that would ground helicopters. She has been fully refurbished, Jake explained as we walked around the vehicle. New engines, updated navigation systems, fresh safety equipment. This thing can go places that no other rescue vehicle can reach. I ran my hands along the sleek hull, feeling the quality of the construction. This was not some homemade contraption. This was professional rescue equipment, built to military specifications and maintained to Coast Guard standards. What kind of response time are we talking about from your house to the beach? I pulled out my phone and showed Jake the satellite map of our community. Direct line from my driveway to the waterline is about 800 yards, mostly downhill with no obstacles. Jake did some quick calculations in his head. 90 seconds, maybe less if you really push it. 90 seconds. Compared to the 3 minutes it used to take by road, or the 20 minutes it now took through the mountain detour, 90 seconds was practically instantaneous. The best part, Jake continued, is that this beauty is legally classified as an emergency response vessel. Once you register it with the State Maritime Authority and get your pilot certification updated, you will have the same legal status as a Coast Guard cutter. The purchase price was substantial, but I had been saving money for years. Emergency response was not just my job, it was my calling. If Karen Thompson wanted to play legal games, I would play them better than she ever imagined. The paperwork took 2 weeks to complete. Vessel registration, pilot certification, insurance documentation, and emergency service authorization all had to be filed with state and federal agencies. I wanted everything to be absolutely legal and unquestionable. While the bureaucracy ground forward, I began training with the Hovercraft at a remote lake 40 miles inland. Jake came out for the first few sessions to make sure I could handle the unique challenges of hovercraft operation. Steering a hovercraft is nothing like driving a car or boat. The vehicle floats on a cushion of air, which means it can slide sideways, spin in place, or glide over obstacles that would stop wheeled vehicles. It takes practice to master the throttle control and steering inputs. But once I got comfortable with the controls, the hovercraft felt like freedom itself. I could race across the lake's surface at 40 miles per hour, then glide smoothly onto the shore without slowing down. I could navigate through shallow marshes, across sandy beaches, or over rocky terrain with equal ease. Each training session filled me with growing confidence and anticipation. Karen Thompson had no idea what was coming her way. She thought she had trapped me with her locked gate and legal maneuvering. But I was about to prove that there is always another way. Sometimes you just have to rise above the problem. The call came in on a perfect Saturday afternoon in late September. Karen Thompson was hosting her monthly HOA social gathering in her backyard, complete with catered appetizers and a full bar setup. I could see the crowd of about 30 people gathered on her expansive patio from my bedroom window. The emergency dispatch crackled through my radio at exactly 3:15 p.m. All available marine rescue units. We have a report of 2 swimmers in distress approximately 400 yards south of Seal Point. Possible riptide situation. Immediate response required. My heart rate spiked immediately. This was it, the moment I had been preparing for over the past month. I grabbed my rescue gear and headed for the garage, but instead of climbing into my truck, I walked over to the corner where my hovercraft sat waiting under a protective cover. I had been keeping it ready for exactly this situation. As I pulled away the cover and began the engine startup sequence, I could hear the sound of conversation and laughter drifting over from Karen's party. She had no idea that her perfect afternoon was about to be interrupted. The twin turbine engines roared to life with a sound like a small jet airplane. The rubber skirt inflated as pressurized air filled the chamber beneath the craft. Within 30 seconds, the SR-6 was hovering 6 inches off my garage floor, ready for action. I guided the hovercraft out of my garage and across my driveway toward the main road. The sound of the engines was impossible to ignore. Conversation stopped. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. Every head at Karen's party turned toward the unexpected noise. That is when I saw her. Karen Thompson stood at the edge of her patio in a flowing white dress, holding a crystal champagne flute and staring at my approaching hovercraft with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. I brought the craft to a hover directly in front of the locked gate that blocked the beach access road. Karen started walking toward me with that familiar look of indignant authority on her face. "Marcus Chen, what on earth do you think you are doing? This is private property, and you are disturbing my guests with this ridiculous contraption." I looked at her through my helmet visor and spoke loud enough for her guests to hear. "Emergency response, Karen. 2 swimmers in distress. Lives at stake." She gestured dramatically toward the locked gate. "Well, as you can see, this road is closed. You will have to find another way to play hero somewhere else." Her guests had gathered behind her now, forming a semicircle of curious faces. Some looked concerned about the emergency. Others seemed more interested in the spectacle of Karen asserting her authority over this strange flying machine. I reached for my radio and made an official announcement. "Maritime Authority, this is Emergency Response Vessel 67 Alpha, proceeding to emergency scene via direct water access route under federal maritime emergency provisions." Karen's face went pale. "What did you just say?" I looked directly at her and smiled. "I said I am going around your gate, Karen." That is when I pushed the throttle forward and lifted off. The hovercraft rose smoothly into the air on its cushion of pressurized air. The sound of the engines reached a crescendo as I guided the craft over the locked gate and into Karen's front yard. The expressions on the faces of her guests were priceless. Mouths hanging open, eyes wide with disbelief. Some people started pointing and taking pictures with their phones. Others stepped backward as if they were witnessing something supernatural. But nothing compared to the look on Karen Thompson's face. Her champagne flute slipped from her fingers and shattered on the patio stones. Her perfectly composed expression crumbled into pure shock as she realized that her gate was completely useless against my amphibious rescue vehicle. I guided the hovercraft across her pristine front lawn, leaving no tire tracks or damage because the craft floated on air. Her prize-winning rose garden presented no obstacle. I simply glided over the flower beds like they were not even there. As I approached the edge of her property where it dropped off toward the beach, I could hear shouting behind me. Karen was screaming something about property damage and legal action, but her voice was drowned out by the roar of my engines and the gasps of her astounded guests. The hovercraft sailed off the cliff edge and descended smoothly toward the beach below. The transition from land to water was seamless. One moment I was flying over Karen's manicured landscaping, and the next I was skimming across the ocean surface toward the emergency scene. Total travel time from my garage to the waterline, 87 seconds. The 2 swimmers were struggling in a riptide about 300 yards offshore. One was clearly exhausted and barely keeping his head above water. The other was trying to help, but making no progress against the current. I brought the hovercraft alongside them and deployed the rescue platform. Within 5 minutes, both swimmers were safely aboard my craft and being transported back to shore. The entire rescue operation took less than 10 minutes from the initial emergency call. As I guided the hovercraft back toward the beach landing site, I could see Karen and her guests still standing at the edge of her property, staring down at the scene in stunned silence. Mission accomplished. The rescued swimmers were shaken but unharmed. Paramedics checked them over while I secured the hovercraft on the beach. The whole rescue had gone flawlessly, exactly as I had trained for over the past month. But as I was packing up my equipment, I could see Karen Thompson marching down the beach access stairs with fire in her eyes. She had changed from her party dress into more practical clothes and carried her cell phone like a weapon. Marcus Chen, you are in serious trouble. I am calling the police right now to report property damage, trespassing, and reckless endangerment. I looked up from securing my rescue gear. Feel free to call anyone you want, Karen. I just saved 2 lives using legally authorized emergency response procedures. Legally authorized. You flew that ridiculous machine over my private property without permission. You damaged my landscaping. You terrorized my guests. One of the rescued swimmers, a man in his 40s still wrapped in an emergency blanket, spoke up. Ma'am, this man just saved my life and my son's life. We would have drowned out there if he had not reached us so quickly. Karen barely glanced at him. That is what professional emergency services are for. This amateur grandstanding is completely unnecessary. I pulled out my documentation folder and showed her the official papers. Emergency Response Vessel 67 Alpha, registered with the State Maritime Authority and authorized for emergency operations under federal maritime law. Every action I took today was completely legal. She grabbed the papers and studied them frantically, looking for some flaw or loophole she could exploit. When she found none, her frustration boiled over into rage. We will see about that. Over the next hour, Karen made phone calls to every official she could think of. The local police arrived first, but after reviewing my documentation and speaking with the rescued swimmers, they concluded that no laws had been broken. Emergency response vehicles have broad authority during active rescue operations, the lead officer explained to Karen. Federal maritime law supersedes local property restrictions in these situations. Karen demanded to speak to his supervisor, then the fire chief, then the mayor's office. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Officials would listen to her complaints, review my documentation, and explain that emergency response operations have legal priority over property rights. The Coast Guard liaison was particularly blunt. Ma'am, this gentleman just completed a successful water rescue using proper procedures and legal authority. I am not sure what you expect us to do about that. By evening, Karen had escalated to filing formal complaints with the city council and threatening civil lawsuits for property damage. She hired a lawyer and began drafting legal documents demanding injunctions against my hovercraft operations. But the media attention was already working against her. The local news station picked up the story that night. Hovercraft hero saves swimmers despite HOA restrictions was the headline. They interviewed the rescued father and son, both of whom credited me with saving their lives. The reporter also interviewed Karen, and that is where things went completely off the rails for her. On camera, she came across as petty and unreasonable, more concerned about her flower beds than human lives. Property values and community standards matter, she insisted. We cannot have people flying around in military vehicles whenever they feel like playing hero. The interview made her look terrible. Social media picked up the story immediately, and Karen Thompson became the face of HOA overreach across the entire country. HOA Karen began trending on Twitter. Facebook groups dedicated to HOA horror stories shared the video thousands of times. Local news stations in other cities picked up the story as an example of bureaucracy gone wrong. Meanwhile, support for my position grew stronger every day. Neighbors who had been afraid to challenge Karen publicly started speaking out. Emergency service professionals endorsed my actions. Marine rescue organizations praised the innovative solution to bureaucratic interference. The city council scheduled a special meeting to address the situation. Karen demanded that they ban hovercraft operations in residential areas. I requested permanent designation of the beach as an emergency access zone. 3 days before the meeting, I received a call from Jake Morrison in San Diego. "Marcus, you are not going to believe this. I have had 12 calls this week from other marine rescue specialists wanting to buy hovercrafts. Apparently, dealing with HOA nonsense is more common than we thought." The story had inspired emergency responders across the country to find creative solutions to bureaucratic interference. Karen Thompson had started a movement, just not the one she intended. Her desperate attempts to maintain control were backfiring spectacularly. The harder she fought, the more unreasonable she appeared to the public. Justice was coming, and everyone could see it except Karen herself. The city council meeting was packed beyond capacity. Over 200 residents filled the chamber, with more watching on live stream. News crews from 3 television stations set up cameras to record the proceedings. Karen Thompson sat in the front row with her lawyer, surrounded by her dwindling group of supporters. The rest of the room was filled with neighbors who had finally found the courage to speak out against her tyrannical leadership. One by one, residents stood up to share their stories of Karen's abuse of power. The elderly man she had fined for using the wrong shade of beige paint. The single mother she had harassed for having a swing set in her backyard. The veteran she had tried to force to remove his American flag because it was too large. When my turn came to speak, I kept it simple. Emergency response saves lives. Bureaucratic interference costs lives. The choice should be obvious. The city council deliberated for less than 15 minutes. The vote was unanimous. The beach area would be permanently designated as an emergency access zone, with full protection under federal maritime law. Karen's lawyer immediately announced plans to appeal, but it was too late. The legal foundation of her power had crumbled completely. Within a week, a recall petition began circulating throughout Ocean View Estates. It needed signatures from 60% of HOA members to force a recall election. By the end of the first day, it had signatures from 85%. Karen Thompson's reign of terror was over. The recall election was held 3 weeks later. Karen lost by a margin of 127 votes to 8. Even some of her closest supporters had abandoned her by then. New HOA leadership took office immediately, with a mandate to restore common sense to community management. Their first official act was to reopen the beach access road for both emergency and reasonable community use. Over the following months, multiple emergency responses validated the improved safety measures. Response times dropped to an average of 90 seconds. The Coast Guard began using our beach as a staging area for regional rescue operations. Karen Thompson moved away from Ocean View Estates 6 months later. Her house sold quickly to a young family with children who were thrilled to live in a community where kids could play outside without fear of HOA harassment. The hovercraft became a permanent fixture in our neighborhood, serving both as emergency equipment and as a symbol of what happens when ordinary people refuse to be bullied by petty tyrants. Sometimes the system fails you. Sometimes bureaucrats choose power over people. But sometimes, if you are creative enough and determined enough, you can rise above it all. Literally.